Well, Jim, I want to talk to you a little bit about how we sort of find that in the midst of crisis. And Jim, I told Jim we had dinner last night. I said, Jim, I'm going to take you through a speed round of crises here. But these are predictable crises that we're going to talk about, not the unexpected crises. Because I want to emphasize predictable crises because many of us, when things happen in our lives, we may think we're the only one. We're the only one who's ever experienced that. And that brings so much more anxiety, worry, and fear, and isolation. So in all of your years, you've met with so many different people at different ages. I want to walk through the teenage years to the 80s. Mm-hmm. And I want you to tell me, on the basis of your conversations with people, what are the predictable crises that we often think we're the only ones going through? So let's talk about the teenage years. What are the predictable crises of the teenage years?
Well, I think some of them are obvious. Our body changes, our socialized roles change, and we're being pulled both by society and by our own biology into something called adulthood. But inside is a frightened child who has no idea what that really means. We all remember that time. And teenagers either wind up hiding out in some way, or they're overcompensating by acting cool and in charge of things. And of course, our ancestors understood this, and so they had rites of passage. And what happens in a passage? Something has been played out, something has died, and you're in that difficult in-between, and something else is wanting to emerge, but it's not there yet, it's not over the horizon. And so the rites of passage help transition youth from dependency and insecurity into functioning adults, albeit in a simpler society than ours. But in our culture, we have no serious rites of passage. And so we have a lot of folks in big bodies out there who've never really left home psychologically or have never really grown up. And what does it mean to be a grown-up, after all? Let me just say in the shortest possible form. To be grown up is to understand and feel accountable for what spills into the world through me. I make choices every day. There are consequences which I can't fully anticipate, and yet they come from me. The only person present in that long-running soap opera that we call our life is us. Now, in the morning, none of us rises and looks in the mirror while brushing our teeth and says, well, today you're going to do the same stupid things you've done for decades, you know. But there's a good chance that we will by day's end. And why? Because so much of our life is on automatic pilot. So I think for so many young people, and of course we have colleges or the Army or whatever, and it's basically a swirling mass of confused adolescents who now have big bodies and often big responsibilities. And very shortly, they're out there functioning as adults, making babies, playing roles in social life, and so forth, and with very little sense of identity or little sense of personal authority. So the biggest crisis, I think, of the early part of our journey is, where are the wise mentors in our time? You see, that's so critical, what a missing role the mentor is in our time. And what do I value, and how do I make choices, and what can I trust? Those are the important questions that are swirling in every youth, but very little out there other than distraction seeks to address those things.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I want to point out about our community is that one of the things that we do is we embrace this challenge by having wonderful Sunday school teachers and youth mentors. And we have initiation rites like Rite 13 or our confirmation experience, as we seek to help people claim that personal authority and understand, and also feel the love and the support of our community, knowing that when we make these commitments throughout the vows that we take, we say, in effect, I will be with you for the rest of your life, for the journey ahead. So that's just one thing that I want you to see that's sort of built into the nature of our community, is helping usher young people with big bodies into an uncertain world, but hopefully with love and courage. Let's go to the 20s and 30s, Jim.
May I just say that I'm pleased to hear that, because it shows you've addressed that, been aware of that, and you've put a structure in place, because that's helping compensate for what's missing out there in the rest of the culture. In the 20s and 30s, it's all about trying to create a life of one kind or another, form relationship, undertake career, perhaps become a parent, certainly play social roles, and so forth. And so much of the energy is addressed to how do I fit in? How do I make my way out there? So it's often a crisis of roadmap. What is the proper roadmap for that? One could say that the first part of our lives is spent trying to develop enough ego strength to leave home, to separate, to step into the world. And when we do that, become functional. And some people are a little more successful in doing that than others, but that's the task of the first half of life. And if a truck ran over us on our 30th birthday or 35th birthday, we might say, well, the person lived a very short but appropriate life because they were out in the world. I've often said to people who are worried about their children in college, I said, it really doesn't matter what major they take, because statistics show us that only 20% of them 15 years from now will be working in that field itself. So it's more about the experience of being on your own and meeting other people and appreciating diversity and learning as broadly as you can, because you'll be pulling on those tools the rest of your life. And so there's where the real education goes on, not in the classroom, or seldom in the classroom. And underneath all of that is this assumption that my socialized role is who I am. If that were true, then we would be nothing but social automatons. Something else is at work, which often leads to the midlife passage, if I may speak to that.
Absolutely.
Why is it that at midlife, and I'm using that term very broadly, anywhere between 30 and 60 actually, suddenly one doesn't feel that the roadmap that I've been following matches the terrain in which I'm in? Or one feels a sense of confusion, even betrayal. I've done all the right things. Why does it not feel right inside? I've reached the top in my area of endeavor, but I find there's no there. Why is it that when I've done the right things, I have this depression, or been self-medicating too much, or have found my marriage in turmoil? And it's that begins to get people's attentions. The first time we truly began to question, now who am I apart from my history? And who am I apart from the roles that I play? Maybe fine roles, maybe not so fine, but who am I apart from all of that? And then another kind of question begins to emerge for a person at midlife. But why am I here really? The question of meaning comes up, I think, in a new and more urgent way. People begin to realize, oh, I am mortal. I know the statistics. I read the paper every day. But that now includes me. You know, maybe when you hit 40, you suddenly realize, my own body is taking me there. These are the crises that are crises of roadmap, if you will, the crises of meaning, crises of identity. And again, we have contrived in our secular world, people like me, to address that with people who come in with 1,000 different presenting issues. But in the end, what's going on inside is a crisis of identity. Who am I apart from my history? And then another kind of question might begin to emerge, and it wouldn't have occurred to us, particularly in the first part of our lives. Because in the first part, the question is, what do I need to do to fit in and, quote, be successful or functional in that world out there? Second half, it's more about what wants to enter the world through me. It's a different matter. That's not about ego development. That often requires the ego submission. I myself was a perfect example of this. I'd achieved all of my goals by the time I was 30. And by the time I was 33, 34, 35, I was in a very deep depression. And I was obliged to enter my first hour of therapy in Philadelphia at that time. And I didn't go thinking, oh, I'm starting the second half of life. I thought, what a failure. I assumed up to that point it was a matter of will, If you wanted to do something, you just willed it sufficiently. But something in my psyche had another opinion. And in my world, and this is going to sound very peculiar to you, we welcome psychopathology. We'll stop for a moment. Psyche is the Greek word for soul, psyche. Pathos is suffering. Logos, expression. When you think that the word psychopathology means the expression of the suffering of the soul, puts a whole different frame on it, doesn't it? Becomes, quote, less pathological, less clinical, and more an issue of meaning. So psychopathology is what calls us to accountability. If I'm living in accord with my own soul, my own psyche, then I'll feel that support and the energy will be available. And most of all, it'll be experienced. It'll be experienced as meaningful, even if it's conflictual and difficult. Mm-hmm. Most of the people we would admire in history didn't have easy lives. We might start with Jesus, for example. Lives of great suffering and privation, but we admire them for the simple reason that they held to something that was profoundly true for them and yet carried them through. So midlife, understood very, very broadly there, occurs when a person is obliged, for whatever reason, to pull out and say, but who am I really? Apart from the role of parent or partner or employee or whatever. Maybe fine roles, maybe not. And what is really wanting expression through me? And that's where life gets really interesting. Because at that moment, then you realize every day there is a large drama going on inside of me. And as Chip has talked about, I know, on other occasions, we begin to realize that the enemies we have to face in this world are not out there, they're in here. Fear and lethargy, those are our two enemies. Two gremlins, I call them, at the foot of the bed. Each morning, they're there. Fear says, it's too much for you. You can't handle this. Chill out. Lethargy says, have a bonbon, turn on Oprah, tomorrow's another day.
Yeah.
And they'll be there the next day. And then you realize, when I've worked, I'm sure you found this, when you've worked with people in the overt phase of dying, the chief regrets are usually for family estrangements or for the life unlived. Those are the deep regrets. And fear and lethargy are the enemies that stand in the way of the life more fully lived. And we all have it, and we all carry it inside.
So, Jim, you would say that I don't want anybody to feel left out of the walk through lifetime of crises, but 40, 50, 60 is really you would say, is the sort of the middle passage. Would you say something about what it's like to go through that yourself, and if you're married with someone who's going through the same thing?
Yes.
And if you could also speak to this mysterious thing called the empty nest. What?
Mm-hmm.
The floor is yours.
Sure. Well, look, the longer we live, the more we experience losses as well. People die, they move out of our lives, relationships end. We live in a very mobile society. One of the things we all find, and you're right, when two people come together originally, they're still young, they're still trying to escape their parents. They have no clue as to what the life journey's about. And it's a small miracle for people to stay together in a healthy and constructive way for the rest of the journey, because their trajectories might actually be quite divergent, and sometimes that has to be honored. Other times what needs to happen is people have to revision their journey to say, all right, whatever our contract was when we signed up for this thing called marriage or committed relationship, we've outgrown it, or it didn't work that well. Now we need to go back to the drawing board and see whom we have become. And from that point, commit to a different kind of contract. And then along the way, we also, just as we were hearing about with the pandemic, when our children leave us, then we realized the degree to which we were invested in that relationship. And single best relationship of my life has been being a parent. When my last child left New Jersey at the time to drive across to a strange place called Dallas, I felt my life was leaving with her. And I played a dirty trick that sometimes psychologists have to play on themselves. What would you say to a client of yours who came to you with this problem? I said, there she goes, driving across the country to a career that's opening up for her, doing exactly what she's supposed to be doing. Good job, well done. Now, that energy that was invested in her has come back to you. What are you going to do with it? And I promise you this is true. As she's driving across the country, I started writing the middle passage. And that was the first book out of, 18, And underneath all of that was all of that other energy. The energy's come back to you now. Where's the new direction that life is asking you to place that? And that's a very constructive question, because we will experience, including the loss of a partner, divorces that occur, debilitating illnesses. Again, there are many things that can shake our structures, as we all know. And then the question is, what provides continuity within us? What provides consistency within us? What can we count on when the outer world changes, as it is always changing?
Jim, let's talk about 70s, 80s, and 90s. You're 81.
81.
Say something about 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Well, again, you have to deal with loss. Many of my best friends have died recently. This past 2020, I spent dealing with 2 cancers. I went through 3 operations, 40 radiation sessions, about 25 chemo infusion, lots of shots, lots of tests, some of which are continuing. But speaking of hope, my hope was not for a long, long life. It was for a life that would be meaningful in the face of that. And I also wish for prolongation, because my wife needs me, for sure. She's 80. And most of all, I wanted to continue to do the things that were meaningful to me. So I was getting up at 5 in the morning in order to get my radiation at 7 in the morning so I could be back by 8:30 to see my first client for the day. And I did that for a long time. And the good news is the current telemetry is very positive, so I may be a danger to Western civilization a bit longer, but it's a time when I think, Erik Erikson said once, it's a time where the tension within is between despair and integrity. Despair over progressive losses, the changes in the body, the loss of friends, one's own imminent demise, the decline of the body that's inevitable, and so forth. If that doesn't happen, it's because you checked out a long time ago. So these are the byproducts of, the luck of long life. But integrity means what? To integrate something. It's a time where one has to find one's own wisdom. We're drowning in information. Information does not equal knowledge. Knowledge is how to understand that information. But wisdom is another matter. What does matter? What does this add up to? What's this about really? And underneath all of that, again, always the question, what is life calling me to at this stage of the journey?
Jim, you have said that the purpose of life is to find meaning, not happiness. Now, you and I like to have a good time. We had a great time last night. We talked about places we like to go. We like to have a good time. And so we're not saying don't have a good time, but would you say something about the sort of societal message of happiness and what happiness is and how often we're supposed to experience it relative to this quest for meaning, and if you could speak to the fruits of meaning. First happiness, then meaning.
Well, sure. This peculiar sentence, but happiness is overrated, really. I know it says in our Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but when Jefferson wrote those words, And the 18th century scholars tell us that meant a life that is satisfying to you is what he meant by happiness, as opposed to being dictated to by someone. And you see, happiness itself is a momentary, transitory experience. It's not a steady state. I know people who are unhappy because they're not happy all the time. Or they're unhappy because their friends on Facebook are happy, right? Well, how do you know? It's because they say so, you see. That happiness is somehow a goal. Happiness, I think, is a byproduct of being in right relationship to your own soul at a given moment. When you're doing what is right for you, it may be very difficult. It may be conflictual. It may be involving suffering. But there's a happiness that can come from that, a byproduct of that experience. So, happiness, I think, can trivialize us. It can also be the birth of addictions. It's like, if this is going to make me happy, I'll have to keep doing that and doing that and doing that and doing that. And it often leads to a sense of sterility or emptiness or burnout or boredom. So meaning is something that carries us through everything. Camus said once when he passed through a very difficult time, he said, I found in myself an invincible summer in the midst of the dark winter. It's a wonderful metaphor. There's an invincible summer in us. That makes me happy. When I was a child, I wanted to be, like most little boys, a Major League Baseball player. But the gods gave Mickey Mantle that body, not me, And so I would have never imagined that I would sit day in, day out, hour after hour, listening to people's problems. And that never makes me happy when I hear those problems, but my work makes me happy. What is more honorific, you know this yourself, than being invited to be part of people's journey, to wrestle with the questions that they wrestle with, and to support them in their process of healing and growth and development. That makes me very happy, but it's a happiness of a different kind. It's a happiness based on the recognition of suffering and privation and, again, the difficulties of this life at times.
And I'm struck in the video and in all of our lives, we don't necessarily have to fundamentally change our careers to engage in that work. It's
Right.
simply there can be, of course, it could mean that we're called to do something completely different, that the soul is calling us to do something different, but it may also mean that we're being invited to do it in a different sort of way, sort of how we show up to all the experiences and relationships of our lives, and how we operate and who we become. I heard someone say one time after a person went through an extraordinary experience in their life, he didn't change his life, but he changed the way he made me feel, because he seemed to be more present to what was really going on. And so that shift away from the ego, from the pursuit of one's own self, one's own personal agenda, to the larger needs, concerns, and the agenda of family, of community, seems to me to be a holy shift. Jim, I want to ask you about the middle passage and what we've been through with the pandemic, because there's a sense in which we've all had these sort of individual things that have happened in our lives, and yet we're all seeking kind of to know what the new roadmap is. There's a kind of a collective middle passage that we're going through right now. First, would you say something about grief? I know that's not the most fun topic in the world, but again, one of the things that I'm trying to do here is, if you've listened to what Jim said about the various crises and different stages of life, and any of that connects with you, welcome to the human race. You're normal. I'm very sorry to tell them that, Jim, because, in Charlotte, everybody wants to be super normal, extraordinary. We were joking that, the moniker in Austin, Texas, Jim came from Texas before he went to D.C., is keep Austin weird. Charlotte, it's keep Charlotte perfect. Don't you think? Right? So we don't want to show up today with the vulnerability, with the reality of life, but one of the realities is that is that we've been hit hard with a lot of different things, and for some people it's been completely debilitating. Other people say it was the greatest period of their lives and their families. But say something about what grief actually is.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me, first of all, Chip, so many clients through the years have said, I wonder what people are thinking about me. And I said, I really hate to tell you this, they're not thinking about you. You know? They're worried about their stuff, you know? Again, that's a legacy, being tiny and dependent upon the world around us, that we get wired to what's the world thinking about me constantly, you see. And that's how we, in some way, sort of facilitate our own separation from our personal authority. And let me just say for a moment, what is personal authority? It requires sorting through the immense traffic that we all have, the bombardment we have from the outer world, but we have bombardment from the inner world as well. Sorting through that and say, which messages come from God? Which messages come from the soul? And secondly then, can I have the courage and integrity to live them to the best of my ability in the world? And that's not something solved once. That's a daily summons. That's a lifelong prospect. And along the way, we're going to experience those things that bring us grief. Grief comes from the Latin gravis. It's related to the word for grave and gravity, because it's heavy. When we grieve, there's a weight upon us. And we have so much to grieve in our time, so many of our fellow Americans and human beings around this world who have died and suffered enormously. And yet, grief is a reminder of how much the gift that was there in the first place. Chip knows my wife and I lost a child a number of years ago at age 38, and I don't know a greater grief than to lose a child. And yet, it reminds me every day how rich our relationship was. And every day is a reminder to me to not complain, but be grateful for the opportunity to continue to serve the values that he and I shared together. So, you know, you honor the loss by serving those values, by carrying forward whatever you cared about together. And that's how grief gets transformed. But it's not like having closure. I hate that word closure. Real tough loss is something you carry forever. But it doesn't dominate your life. It doesn't dictate your choices. And slowly, and Carl Jung said once, you know, we never really solve the core problems, but we can outgrow them. That's a big difference. Because recorded within us, neurologically and emotionally, are all the issues of our entire history. That's why tonight you can have a dream in which your third grade teacher shows up and you think, I haven't thought about her in decades. What's she do? She's alive and well intrapsychically. Everything that's ever happened is in there. So given what stimuli or circumstances occur, that material can be triggered. And that's why so often we find ourselves in repetitive behaviors or caught in old familiar places and don't know why. And it's literally because it triggered something in the unconscious. And of course, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. So we don't know that's happened. And part of my job as a psychoanalyst is to try to work with the apertures we have into the unconscious. So then the question is, what has come up? Why? What has that touched in me? Where have I been here before? In those moments, you see, we begin to recover a certain sense of sovereignty in our personal lives. And we care less about what other people think about us, but we begin to think about what does our own soul think about us. As I mentioned, psychopathology is the autonomy of the human soul. When it shows up, it may not always be pleasant, but it's a summons to recognition of something. Something is calling out for our attention. Mm-hmm. Something is calling out for our respect, maybe our love as well. And when we begin to turn and value that and dialogue with that, that's what promotes healing. Mm-hmm. Healing is where we overcome these deep divides that we all carry within us.
So I want to just highlight and underscore what you just said about the summons. Like, this could be one of the great take-homes of thousands of take-homes for today. If I approach my anxiety, my depression, my grief as yet another explanation and confirmation for the fact that I'm not good enough, I'm not capable enough, life is never going to get any better, then that's certainly going to take me to the place where I become my own self-fulfilling prophet. If alternatively, I see my anxiety, my fear, my grief as a summons, well, that's a very different sort of way to frame it, isn't it? That is to say that perhaps for all of us today, there's a summons that's taking place. And to see that as not a fault, but to see it as you say, a moment of the soul speaking, a moment calling out for integrity, calling out for a deeper alignment with who we are, how we spend our time, what we do. But Jim, it takes courage, obviously, to come and to make the phone call to a friend, to a priest, to a therapist, to a group, to walk into Alcoholics Anonymous or any sort of thing. I wonder if you could say something about spirituality. You and I have talked before about a healthy spirituality and an unhealthy spirituality. And I'm sort of struck that one of the things that was so unique about Jesus was his sort of groundedness in the midst of all these siren calls to become something else, for him to call upon his own authority, the authority that he perceived was given to him by God. There were so many moments when he could have said, I'm out, or wouldn't have stood up in the face of the Pharisees and said, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. That there was a real sort of summons, a real courage, and a real realization of personal integrity that he needed to pursue, that we all need to pursue if we're going to sort of catch up to our own meaning, to our own destiny. So say something about healthy spirituality, ways that religion can empower, and ways that religions also can diminish the soul.
Well, you asked about 12 questions there, Jim.
Yeah.
Let me just go back to one of the first ones, and that is the whole thrust of so much modern psychology, medicine, psychiatry, pharmacology, etc. is how quickly do we get rid of suffering? In my profession, we always ask, why has it come? That's a different question, isn't it? Or another way of putting this is, what is my soul asking of me now? Why has this come to me? If I experienced a depression at midlife, having solved the goals of my cultural experience, why did the psyche revolt? That wasn't a question that occurred to me at the time. It's like, how quickly do I get rid of this and get on the road again, so to speak? Then we'd have to say, I am invited into a summons, if you will, into a conversation with my own depths. And in that conversation, something over time is going to emerge. And that will lead us to our deepest spirituality. Much of what passes, and I don't want to sound too judgmental here, in the popular world out there is either people infantilizing human beings, evoking fearful parental complexes to bring them to correct behaviors or right attitudes. And I think what it winds up doing is infantilizing them. Or promising an easy path. Well, we know the path is not always so easy. Spirituality also is found. It's not a choice we make, it's something we can experience. I used a phrase some time ago today where I said, what quickens the spirit inside of you? If you and I walk into an art museum, let's say, and you're touched by a certain painting and maybe moved to tears or frightened by it, and I walk by indifferently, well, which one of us is right? That's a foolish question. You know, your soul, the topography of my soul are quite different. And this touches you, this touches me here. When we experience that, there's a certain resonance that occurs inside, resonance, resounding. When something is deeply true for us, it resonates within us, which is why it's hard to transmit it to other people. And at the same time, resonance is not something we create, it's something we experience. So our spirituality is found where our spirit is quickened. And Chip and I were talking last night that one of the hopes and functions of this particular church is to provide a platform, an aperture whereby people can experience the quickening of the Spirit. And it will appear in different forms for different people. And together, what community is the support of each person finding his or her pathway to the opening of the life of the Spirit. And when it's there, something grows and is alive within us. And when it's not, it becomes simply routinized. And so much of our life is on automatic pilot. The Danish theologian Kierkegaard talked about a man who read the Copenhagen Tagblad, or whatever the name of the newspaper is, one morning and saw his name was in the obituary column, and he didn't realize he died because he didn't realize he'd been here. And Oscar Wilde said once, most people live someone else's life. You know? All right, are you living the life you're supposed to be living? And who says so? And how do you know? Those are the questions. And that question was there for the child we all were, and it gets sort of taken away by the noise in the world outside. And recovering a personal relationship to that question is how one's spirituality becomes authentic, as opposed to imitating the behaviors and values of other people.
We hear the summons, Jim, but we fear that if we begin to get into it, it could be terribly disruptive to the current path that we've developed. Say something about the risk of answering the summons, and maybe the danger of not. How does someone go from a life that perhaps is not aligned, as we say, that if we acknowledge that this is rather routine and normal to show up to a certain time in our life, and particularly in the midst of the pandemic with so many things that have changed, how do we find the courage to do that?
Well, first of all, the question is, what is it in me that resists so strongly? And I think there are three things. One is anxiety, because the summons to engage our life in depth is intimidating. It causes us anxiety because it might well lead to change. It might lead to transcending certain associations or values we've carried in the past. Secondly, there often is a kind of spiritual laziness. It's like, but it's so hard to do this. You know, it's so much easier to rest easy in the saddle and, you know, life will carry me somehow. And thirdly is that what I'll call the moi complex. Like, moi? Me? You know, there's a great deal of skepticism we all have about our own depth, our own spiritual depth, and the fact that there is something called a soul that is soliciting our response and is asking us a conversation. And so those are the elements of resistance, you know, laziness, anxiety, and you know, the disbelief in our own possibilities. Because underneath all of that is a basic question. Why am I here? Apart from all of my roles, why am I here? Apart from being a taxpayer, breathing so many times till I stop breathing, why am I here? Courage for me has always been, life has to have meaning. It's full of joy, it's full of suffering, but what does it mean to me? It's something I thought about as a child. It's something I thought about. And in the early part of my life, I tried to do that through learning, and that was very rich and valuable. I'm grateful for that. I also know that it left large pieces of myself behind. We all leave pieces of ourselves behind, and part of what the second half of life about is going back and picking up some aspects of our life we had to leave behind. Every time you choose A, you can't choose B, C, and D. There are areas of creativity, areas of curiosity, areas of interest. The things that spark that spirit are left behind. And you can't save that for retirement. A lot of people don't reach retirement. A lot of people suddenly fall into a depression at retirement. If you're not living it now, when do you plan to live it, you see? So behind all of that, underneath courage can be desperation in the creative sense. This life has to mean something to me. And it's not necessarily going to be what I hear from other people, maybe with the best of intentions. But what causes that resonance within me? What causes that quickening of the spirit within me? And that's your link, in my view, to divinity, you see. That's where the Spirit of God enters the individual human being. It's not a committee, although we can share this in communities like this, but it's something that's unique to each one of us.
With just a few minutes to go, Jim, I want to talk about, I made the comment, keep Charlotte perfect, because I do think that there is a strong impulse to conformity in this town and in every town. Conformity was what made it safe for us at the beginning of life,
Yes.
Our ability to fit in at the beginning of life. But toward the middle, of life and in the stage of life of wisdom, we begin to realize that maybe perhaps after all we weren't created to fit in. Could you say something about that? Fitting in?
Well, again, for every child, given the message that we all experience and I reference, the world's big and I'm not, the world's powerful and I'm not, fitting in is critical. We need the approval of people around us, starting with our family of origin. But over time, then you realize that furthers the sort of estrangement from my own soul, from my own center. So the second half of life is about recovering it. That's what we mean by personal authority. But sooner or later, Kierkegaard said the crowd is untruth. The larger the number of people, the lower the level of awareness typically. And what this means then is if your psyche, that is to say the totality of your being or the presence of your soul, were happy with just fitting in, you would know it. Because you'd feel that deep sense of purpose and that deep sense of direction that comes from those experiences. I can say to you in complete good faith, if I need what I couldn't have said as a younger person, because when I was young, I thought I've got to figure out what it's all about and try to find the right path that way. Today I could say to you, if I need to make a decision, whether it's something mundane about how to start a new book or something like that, or how to deal with a certain patient or whatever, or a life choice, I put it in there, metaphorically. It goes down into the solar plexus, and something in there works on it. And it always gets back to me. It might wake me at 3 in the morning a week from now, might come as a dream. I might be driving down the highway and suddenly it's clear when I'm distracted. Something in there knows what's right for me. And my ego consciousness needs to align itself to that. When we do, then we experience that momentary happiness that we were talking about. When we do, we feel purposeful. We feel energized. At 81, I'm supposed to be dead or retired. I couldn't imagine not doing what so energizes me. And I say that simply as in a selfish way. That's a good way to live. It's meaningful. It's the richest time of my life, I would say. In the midst of suffering, the midst of grief, in the midst of hardship, the best time of my life, because I feel this deep sense of purpose and that deep sense of resonance which is within.
And what does this have to do with hope? It's all very heavy and serious, isn't it? What does it have to do with hope? Well, I think it's all very, very hopeful because it's the truth. And I think hope always seems to start with truth. The summons to our lives, although it may be uncomfortable, is truth. And hope, as I'm listening, Jim, hope is not necessarily a momentary feeling. It's the invitation to do the work. And I think the work of figuring out what meaning and purpose is, figuring out what it means to love, what it means to offer grace and compassion to other people who are also going through a similar journey. Hope is a process, isn't it? Hope is to say, today, I've heard some things that have been deeply meaningful. I need to think about these. Maybe I need to watch this again. But I'm beginning to sense that there needs to be some deeper thought, deeper prayer, deeper movement that's going to move me to the place where I'm being called to be in my life. And I think that's, whether that's in the midst of intense personal suffering because of a recent loss, whether it's some sort of rehabilitation to your body, whether it's the recovery from addiction, whether it's dealing with a child that's struggling that you don't feel connected to, whether it's a marriage that's been disruptive, and whatever it is, I think with God's love and the love that we have for each other, we're able to do the work of hope, which I think, Jim, is showing up to the questions of our lives.
Yes, I would add that hope is the openness of being. Hope is openness to possibility. Despair is the refusal to accept the possibilities that life brings, outer possibilities and inner possibilities. And hope is, as we know, that which gives us the opportunity to step into another kind of journey, knowing that at some level we are supported and sustained along the way.
Well, everyone, what an amazing hour. Jim, we cannot thank you enough for coming here to be with us today, and to everyone. I'm excited about getting into it, to the questions of our lives, and because we can't run from them. I'm excited about taking this journey to discover the power of hope, which I think is going to bring us all a great deal of meaning, a great deal of healing as we open ourselves to the possibilities that lie ahead. Thank you all so much for coming today. Jim, most grateful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.